Hello, everyone. This is Shane Conklin. Oh, hi, Mark. How are you?
Hey, Shane. Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Esty.
Good morning.
Good morning,
Hi,
Emojis.
Shane.
Hi.
So today, participant is only 4
So far. So far.
so far. Okay, so we should wait.
So, Shane, I'm not sure how you would like to structure this. I know last time you were not able to be here, and I hope your friend's family is
Thank you.
better. I know these are always difficult times. I don't know what kind of structure you'd like to see this meeting.
It's up to you.
Okay. I mean, so basically, I'm just going to, jump in with the agenda slide of
Perfect.
what we're going to cover. And as far as the recording, is that automatic?
Yes. On this line, it's automatic, so everything is recording right now.
Okay, so whenever we start this meeting, because last time I believe I used my own Zoom account, and I didn't think about that. But if we have this meeting and we always enter this Zoom,
It's automatically recorded. Yep.
okay, got it. And do we have to do something at the end, like say stop and save, or it'll happen automatically?
Totally automatic.
Okay, I love automatic.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's convenient. It's very convenient.
Okay. So we can begin. I'll start out slow and pick up if anybody joins in. What I thought I would do is do a very quick kind of summary of what happened last time, but really repeat the topics that we went over last time, because it's good to have the discussion from a larger group about the same items. Not to say any decisions were made last time, they weren't, but I'd like to revisit, tell what kind of position we came down on. Nothing major was decided, but there was a few items that were discussed that I think would be interesting to hear the Asia side of perspective. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. So again, just as a reminder to people, we actually have a documented process for this activity, and it's summarized here on which I set up was the new wiki. And this is the development process we're going to follow as usual. I'm not going to go through it step by step, but if people have an opportunity to review it and they want to discuss this process, possibly make recommendations to changing it, it has evolved with each spec. I'd be happy to have those discussions as well, the process we use to go through the release. Okay. Go back. Okay. As people well know, there is a 2.4 release candidate C4. Let me briefly ask Shane if you have any updates on the status of becoming an ISO accepted spec.
I do. So we have had feedback from ISO, and they said that we can expect to become an ISO standard on the 22nd of September.
Great. And so that was clearly excellent feedback, but did they have any other feedback, like things might have to be changed?
No. So it seems that we have completed the translations, and we're now into the actual approval voting without any requests for changes at this time.
Okay. So your expectation is the 22nd, but that's not something we're talking about yet to the
Right.
outside world.
Oh, we are. We can talk to the outside world about it. So ISO put it in their database of scheduled activities. So we can tell people that currently ISO have us scheduled for September 22nd to complete the ballot voting process.
Okay, excellent. So then that leads to the kind of a next question with respect to how far do we go with this new spec? This is not going to instantly become the ISO. We're going to take the ISO draft, accept version, and extend it using or following a process they probably have as well. That's another question I would have is, once it is accepted, is there a set of guidelines, Shane, on how we would actually go and update to a newer version?
I will need to confirm the details on that, but my understanding is that it will be the same as this time. Basically that we complete it, then we submit it as an update, and there's a certain amount of time for comments. So very similar.
Okay, great. So I was hoping to, here it is, find it here. So this is out there. This is the one that's going to be with us for quite a while. Now the question is timing on what we expect for this release. Right now we could tentatively assume an April release like we normally do, or maybe a March release if there's a a collaborative or a summit next year. What do we call it now? It's not collaborative. It's
Oh yeah, the
I don't know.
member summit or something. Yeah.
Yeah, the member summit in March. We could try to continue to target that. Is that what you might think, Shane? That might work, or we might have a little bit more. We need more runway given that we have a more formal.
My feeling is that we might have requests for more runway, but you know, I can envision people being comfortable with a suggested draft of the spec being ready in April and then pushing hard for a large public comment period and so on. But I would say that there should be plenty of runway past April if and when desired.
Okay. I'm not going to go over these at any length other than to quickly summarize them. These are our guiding principles. These two have evolved. They don't evolve radically usually, but this is an opportunity at the beginning of a cycle to remind everybody of our guiding principles and to talk about whether we should possibly tweak them. And the guiding principles, first and foremost, it's about building trust around the use of open source, right? We have to keep that in mind. That's our focus. And right now, the focus is on license compliance. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit because of our discussion last time that we might explore the possibility of broadening that. And we'll talk about that, about security, for example. But right now, what is absolutely true is we're very focused on building trust around open source with respect to license compliance. Focus on the the what and why, right? We don't try to be prescriptive. That's always a very important piece of how we do it. The other thing is less is more. We're always looking at a very as simple and clean and short spec as possible, which I think something we've succeeded at. It is 12 pages, but there's a lot of white space in that, and it's really laid out nicely and simply. Whenever we get up against a situation where we can take away a word or two and it still preserve meaning, it generally tends to be a better spec. And finally, we do function as an open source initiative first and foremost, meaning we are very open, allow anybody to participate, yet we will evolve and adopt to make sure that we also can function as a standard initiative. That's probably a little bit of a balance. And that's where we might alter our development process that we talked a little earlier. We might alter our guiding principles to make sure we have that healthy balance. But these are the guiding principles that I ask everybody who wants to contribute to read and understand before they contribute. Okay. Any questions or about that?
One question, or really just a request for clarification. So the idea of less is more has been really important to the spec. And I suppose the question would be, why is it so important? Did we have a bad experience with too much detail, or did we have knowledge of other projects suffering from putting more is more?
It came about because it was more of a design principle that I think people in the earlier days thought it was important to uphold. It often reminds me of what Albert Einstein once said: things should be made simple as possible, but no simpler, right? Um, the idea is really things tend to be more coherent whenever you can say it and say it in a terse enough way to the point where it has meaning, but it doesn't have too many words that create ambiguity. That's, I think, the heritage of that. Do you have some thoughts about why it might be problematic?
No, no, no. I think it's fantastic. It reminds me of I think it was Mark Twain wrote a letter and he said,
Yes, yes,
I'm sorry this letter is so long. I didn't have time to write a short one.
yes. Very much in that spirit as well.
Yeah.
And it's
Oh,
a
I think
quote. Yeah. It's a quote. That other quote, Mark Twain's quote, is another one that often comes to mind, you know. And yeah, finally, yeah. I was once taught in just writing, write as much as you can. You're never done though until you have no more to add. You're done when you have no more to remove, which is a similar concept.
right.
So, yeah. So okay, so those are these are core principles. We can do two things. We can alter them, or we could add a principle if people feel it's necessary and that something's being missed in our process.
Yeah, I support less is more, because as you may know, the software engineers hate the process. They hate a lot of process. So I think
Yes,
it's great.
excellent. Thank you for your feedback there. Okay, so what's the objectives of 3.0? And the one in red is the one that was suggested at the last meeting. So I think it's worth for us to discuss it here. And again, these are going to get solidified very quickly, but this is an opportunity to discuss them. So the first one is, let's get that feedback from people already implementing it, from the spec, and make it better from that feedback, right? We know there are more people than ever who are adopting this and implementing it. So basically, first and foremost, how to make it better to understand it, right? Second one is from those who are struggling to implement it, why is it difficult? How might we make it easier? The third objective here, make sure that we are absolutely including all the necessary requirements for a quality compliance program, right? Our goal is to have what I refer to the minimum. Like we want the absolute set. Every compliance program that is of a good quality must have, right? And almost like no more than that. Like we expect every quality program to have it. We don't want something that's some programs might have, but we wouldn't expect another program to have. And then the fourth one here is people had suggested that, they identified the fact that we're here to build trust around the use of open source. Okay. And we do that through making sure that the licenses are there and complied with. But people also recognize that there were other areas where we could help build trust with open source. An obvious one that people are talking a lot about is security vulnerabilities management. So if I get software from someone, I want to know that they possibly have a process in place to vet and manage security vulnerabilities. Now, this is not being even proposed as an extension of the spec, but to explore this idea this round. It's unlikely that it will enter the spec in 3.0, but to have this discussion of whether it makes sense to have this one or others, like maybe export. So we know that other organizations typically have a compliance group, but they also have the security group, and they might even have security guidelines. But what we would focus on is making an additional potential module that you, let me say one other thing I think is really important. When we look at software activities around trust, I think of at least 3 to 4. I think of license compliance, security, export, and functionally safe software, okay? And all of those, in order to achieve them, have a common theme a bill of materials. You need to know what open source is in the product to build trust around that open source. And at the core of what OpenChain does is it requires every organization to have a bill of materials, produce one for every release, right? And that is actually input into these other processes, whether it's security, export compliance, or functionally safe software management. And so we can continue our mission to help people trust the open source in their products by possibly extending how we look at trust or how we communicate that trust. So I'm going to pause for a second and see what people's thoughts are.
Regarding the security, if I recall correctly, the new version of SPDX also have the print on that.
That's correct. To me, SPDX is a format standard for representing information to exchange between organizations, and license compliance is where they started, and they are looking at extending it to include security vulnerability information as well as other information, I believe. And so it's highly complementary to that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the synergy.
Sure. And I do want to come back and make sure we keep the focus on trust, open source and trust. Now, this would be a big step, and I don't think this is a step that can be discussed much further without going to our board and the advisory committee. And this was brought up by the group last time. So I'd like to see what Shane thinks about whether this is something relevant to our mission, potentially.
It's a really good question. Yeah, we had some great feedback from things like the NTIA, National Telecommunications Agency in the US. Basically, there seems to be a lot of interest in working out how OpenChain can be supportive of existing activities in security and help fill gaps. So it seems like at the very least, cross-referencing OpenChain with existing security standards and perhaps filling in the places where there's nothing for open source security today could be received well by the market. So it definitely seems like a discussion to have.
Yeah, I'm familiar with NTIA. I've been following since the beginning, and I've actually brought up OpenChain in the earliest days. They still had some fuzziness around it, but I think they're starting to understand it. I don't know, did you have an opportunity to reach out and present to them, Shane?
I did. So I had a presentation to the SBOM work group about almost a month ago now. And they wanted to kick the tires on understanding the general comments on OpenChain. And my impression was that they are keen to work together. So they've already decided to collaborate with SPDX, and they'd like to share notes with us to make sure that all the positive things our standard does, like identification of packages, version number, and so on, can feed into their security mission as well.
Yeah. So I think, again, what's really, to that point about earlier about SPDX and our complementary to their mission to move forward on security, I think at the core, something very special about OpenChain is the bill of materials and the requirement of a bill of materials in that you're making a statement that I'm delivering you software and we have a bill of materials. It's a very powerful thing, which clearly I think can complement that initiative, which is essentially, like, to me, the SBOM work is really, can we come up with a standard for exchanging software bill of materials? You know, and SPDX is growing itself to become a bill of materials representation. So I think that all makes sense. Okay. One of the downsides of this, and I think we have to be very careful of this, people might get intimidated or like, oh, I just want license compliance, right? That's what we do. I don't handle security. They get spooked by that. But I would say that this would be a potential option that you would have. And we talked about this in the earliest days of OpenChain. I remember having this initial discussion where we talked about having these modules, but it was too early. It was too early because I think we just wanted to make sure we got license compliance right, and we didn't want to dilute ourselves. But what we can do is if we do go this path, and we do explore this, to let people know that this would not be an absolute requirement to be OpenChain conforming. OpenChain conforming means you have the open source license compliance stuff, and that's like table stakes. You need to have that to just ship software. If you're not compliant with the licenses, you don't have the freedom to distribute your own software, right? So you can't get around that. Security is an extra, right? And it could be an optional additional badge, or however we want to talk about it. So you're OpenChain conforming, and I also have the security module, or whatever we might call it. So I wanted to put that out there and make sure we don't make this sound like it's an absolute, you must also be security vulnerable conforming. Okay.
Yeah, I think most of the company needs this feature regarding the vulnerability in open source.
I think so. In fact, I just went through a software audit. So in our company, because we're sitting in the middle of the supply chain, we have our larger customers will come in and audit our software engineering processes. And I was in a meeting, I was brought in to answer that question, how do you handle open source, right? And that's always a fun one for me, because I always say, oh, we're OpenChain conforming, this is the spec, we adhere to all these steps of the spec. And that conversation tends to go very smoothly and very short, actually, what they usually would expect. And the reason why I highlight that, the one thing that caught me to this last go around was they were expecting us also to have our, some practices around security. Now, we do as a company have our security group, but somehow they assumed that you had that security piece built into your open source compliance piece. Like, you're grabbing open source and you're managing open source, you must be managing security of the open source, or at least vetting it and reviewing it. I had to, tell them, no, you got to go talk to that other group. And that was felt a little awkward. But what I'm seeing is there's an expectation, especially in the supply chain, around security, vulnerability management, and particularly open source as well.
Yes, because there are many regulations or standards. In their requirement, they mention that the company have to manage the open source vulnerabilities. For example, the SP 800, 161, and IEC 62443, etc.
Yeah. So again, let me just conclude. Oh, by the way, before we go any, should there be any other objectives for this round of the spec?
Oh, I have a suggestion. And this is probably implicit. It's just to have the maximum possible capture of the new user base. So the people who are hearing about the ISO standard and trying to funnel their comments into our issue tracker and so on.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe that in a more, like, as an objective?
To ensure that new parties to the specification editing process have quick and easy access to provide feedback.
Okay.
I realize it's implicit, but I just brought it up because I'm sure we're going to get some really useful feedback from completely new companies in new markets. We just have to work out how to receive it.
Sure. And I think that can, I took a note there, and I'll add that to make it more enabling for new people to contribute.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark.
Okay. Now, we do have on our, see if I can find it on the, over here, contributing to the spec. We have a very small piece right now. This is on the wiki, right? I think that one of the requirements right now is we do require them to read the spec. The FAQ, because that's really important to understand some of the decisions that were made and why they were made. And also this is how they can track. But I think what we can do is expand out this whole section here. This is more of a implementation of that objective where we might, focus that effort. Okay. All right. So next I want to do is jump into some of the issues that we discussed last time. So this is where we get to now really begin the process of, changing the spec or evolving the spec. Okay. And I'll tell you some of the points reached last time and then see if you guys want to build on top of that. So in the last version, in the current version of the spec, that's, the 2.1, it talks about, this is about looking at software from which is comprised of open source. And the concern here is that it sounds like we're assuming that the software is 100% comprised of open source. So if I can pull up the spec to show you where that comes up, what I'm going to do is to search for the word comprise. Okay, let me zoom in. Excuse me. So the objective is to benchmark between the exchange of software solutions comprised of open source software. The concern here is in that statement, it sounds like that this is only software that is comprised of open source. Where our intended, intention here is to say, this is software which happens to be also constructed for some of it from anywhere between 1 to 100% might be open source, right? And we're focused on that open source piece. And I think that's important because this is not about only open source software, things that are 100% open source. So I want to get people's thoughts here if they find that a concern or confusing. So one of the suggestions was to use like the phrase something like make use of software that makes use of open source. From the software solutions that make use of open source. So I guess, go ahead.
I mean, I understand that software solutions making use of open source now is effectively 100%, right? I mean, we're hearing people say 99 to 100% of software they look at has open source. So
that is my assumption, yeah.
Yeah.
My assumption is actually every piece of software that's given to me has some open source in it, and it can range between 1% of it to 100%.
Right. So I guess the only implicit assumption we have there is that everything is open source. So when we say software that contains open source, we're sort of saying everything.
Yeah, right. It's software that is 100% comprised. It kind of suggests that. Was never the intent.
Right.
So do people feel that, I would, if people feel that's a place where we need to make clarification, I can come up with some drafting and then we can review that.
Can I say something?
Please.
This is Fukuchi.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes we meet some situation that we don't use some OSS component, but that component included in software. That means that we intentionally we don't use such OSS, but at the result, the software contains the software. So I like the proposal of Andrew, the containing the open source. That is my comments.
Okay. No, great. I mean, I think that's in the spirit of what the suggestion is. Yeah. So you're, So we want to make sure that we communicate this notion of all the open source that's in that software solution. Okay. So what I will do then, since both meetings groups have kind of expressed a similar concern, I'll go ahead and try to draft terminology using either what Andrew has provided and or some of the suggestions that have come up, make use of or contains, and to achieve the effect of what's being asked here. Okay. Moving on to the next topic is bill of materials. Is well understood. So his concern here, and we use the term bill of materials without defining it. But the concern is that Andrew's pointing out that he believes that some people have an idea what that is, but others may not. Now, the NTIA, the group that Shane had mentioned, the U.S. agency that's looking at helping to drive the standardization of format for a bill of materials, has a definition of I don't know if they have a formal definition actually, but they will have some perspective on that. One of the concerns here is a bill of materials is a concept that's sometimes hard to universally define, because software could be a component could be a single file, a source, a .h file, like from C or something. It could be a binary, an entire binary program. It can be a library. It could be an entire program. It could be a container, a software container, or it could be an entire Linux runtime, which has many containers running in it, right? And one of the challenges is, can we come up with a universal definition of what a bill of materials is? And I think sometimes, I actually almost tempted to say we should delegate that to something like the NTIA, and we just make the assumption that there is a definition out there and let people choose the definition. But that's what I see the challenge here is. But let me pause and see what people think. Do people feel comfortable with the term? Who believes the term could be ambiguous and problematic? Is probably a better way of asking that.
I don't have a particular comment on this, though I just note in general that Andrew tends to be including client feedback, so it's just worth noting that.
Mm-hmm. I think what we'll do is we'll continue to have that discussion. Right now, I don't see an upswell of concern right now. I think people are generally okay with the term not being defined. I actually think it's probably a feature at the moment, meaning because I mentioned that a software, we know what it means. It's a list of open source. And by the way, a lot of people that work in a certain space, like maybe software as a service, they think of, well, these well-defined GitHub repos, right? That's the component. But I can tell you in the embedded world, they're cut and pasting a lot of stuff from, I can see 3 different projects and cut and pasting from 3 different, creating a new component. It's really hard to bring those two together. But let's continue that discussion. I think it's worthwhile, and I'd like to see Andrew continue to make the case for it and maybe convince others. Okay. Okay, so the next one. Okay. So the next one, we have should, the word distributes. It's one of those terms. It's a very magical word within our world, right? It's in the spec we refer to the distribution of software, and that's assuming that there's an exchange from passing of software from one entity to another. Now, Andrew felt that because of the AGPL, that you may make your software available, like on a network, right? But you're not really distributing it, and therefore you still have obligations. And so he felt that maybe we should go further and clarify that, particularly for the SaaS products of the world. I mean, the other possibility that was discussed last time is we might choose a different word to convey, which is the wording used, that was the word that was used in the GPL3, and I believe the AGPL, to replace the word distributes, because they felt the word distributes wasn't always universally defined, or it had, different languages might define it differently. So for this group, do people feel strongly compelled to make this distinction? And I do want to see a strong support for a change to the spec, right? It's kind of like when you have a constitution of country or whatever, you always can make changes and tweak things, but I would like to see multiple people championing a change such as this one. So who believes the word distributes may not be meaningful or semantically correct? Semantically, I mean, the definition of it doesn't truly capture the entire essence of what's being exchanged, I guess, or used between two parties. So I'm not hearing anybody feeling strongly for the need to change. I'm not saying it doesn't add clarification, but at this moment, I'm not hearing strong emphasis to change it, which was
Hi,
similar to,
Mark.
yeah.
Hi, Mark. This is Tom Osaki from Fujitsu. And yeah, for the third point is very aggressive because the OpenChain specification is just closely related to the licensing obligation and makes available, and also the SaaS product related things are just like an issue of the MongoDB or Redis or other things that the organization who makes now open source software is just not receiving the fair profit from SaaS providers, and so there will be much more discussion included in the wording. And if you only include limit the word distribute, that conforms with the historical usage of the term, but makes available brings a lot more discussion rather than much more than clarification. It's not just only the clarification, but also that the inclusion of many issues that are currently occurring, I think.
Right. You think it'll broaden the meaning and possibly create confusion? Or is that what you're suggesting? Or not confusion,
yes.
but it'll change the semantics more than we may want to. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
but that will bring some ambiguity.
It may introduce some ambiguity, is what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. Okay, I'm gonna make a note here. Oops. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts about it? Anybody feel that they believe it's an important inclusion to add? Okay, so I will add these comments to the, each of these topics are included in our wiki, and I'll include these comments on there and let the discussion continue. These, by the way, these are always meant to be, discussions that are left out there for a while, so that others can have an opportunity to comment. So this is a topic that we didn't get to last meeting, but I think it's great that we'll start it here, and then we can carry it over back to the other meeting, okay? So Hans had asked if we can provide this in kind of a markdown or something that we can, I guess, basically do maybe pull requests on. I actually have no problems with that. I wouldn't make it. How can I think it would be a great opportunity to have an ability to have additional tools for people to communicate changes, but I don't see it as the working on the document that becomes final. Right now, the spec is in Microsoft Word, and it actually is not a document that's expected to change big changes. We continue to be in evolution. In the beginning, it was much more bigger. There were bigger changes, and we used to use a wiki to have people mark up and comment and so forth. I think we could create an opportunity for people to create a markdown, but that wouldn't work on the final version of it. Because of formatting reasons, the ISO group has well-defined considerations around that, and that's the concern I have. I think it's a good thing to have an additional thing, a document, if someone wants to produce a markdown version of it, to allow people to make their comments on that version. But I don't see it as the definitive document from which we go to press with, so to speak. In other words, we actually use to ship. Thoughts? Do people feel that the way we do it now is a little rigid? I mean, it's rigid for a reason, but maybe it's too rigid. So no one is feeling this strong concern about having a markdown version or not. I still would like to encourage, and if Hans wants to generate a markdown version for people to work on as a side, kind of like a whiteboard, I would encourage it. But it wouldn't be the version from which we submit the final spec for people to download. So usually, again, we'll go into Word. I would consider an alternative to Word. I know that sometimes people don't like proprietary tools, but it's got to be at least as powerful, you know, in an expression to maintain formats, particularly if ISO has certain concerns around formatting, which I believe they do.
Yeah, especially for the open source developers, they don't like the proprietary tools, as you may know.
I understand. I have a different philosophy. I believe you choose the best tools that help you do your job. And I actually think there are open source tools that are fantastic. Linux is a fantastic example of an operating system that is superior for what it does, right? And I think Linux should be used. But I have a general philosophy of best tool for the job. But that doesn't mean we cannot allow people to have access to a markdown version or an ASCII doc. We can. And people can work on that and draft off of that. That could be very powerful collaboratively.
Yes, I participate in open source community for years, and many of my friends in the community, they don't like the, for example, Microsoft Office, so they don't use that.
Well, the other question I have to ask is, what do the people at large like to use, right? What's the comfort zone of the large community we're trying to be? Yes, there are some people who really like. In fact, we do use like GitHub's wiki, right? And we do put the spec in and copies of it into GitHub, and that is a very helpful and useful way of collaborating. I guess the question I always have is, what's a more universal way of enhancing collaboration?
I think the markdown format is popular because recently Open Source Summit America, they only accept PPTX formats, and they got lots of brands.
Sure. So actually, we actually, I think the one thing I want to highlight, and I think this is Shane's earlier point, make it easy for people to onboard on the process of contributing. We have to include that as an objective here. And I think this would be definitely in that spirit of that, right? Can we continuously have several different ways people can provide their feedback into the process so that we can have that discussion? And I think having a markdown version is useful for that. Especially for those who like Markdown or feel strongly about that. But that's just going to be a way, to me, it's another way of expressing themselves. Some people can post their concerns as an issue on our wiki, as they often do. They can post something to an email list. They can participate in this kind of meeting, or they can possibly, mark up the Markdown, so to speak. So I think if we go that path, I think that's a good path. We'll just see if we can make it very clear to anybody who wants to participate. These are the different ways you can provide your feedback. Any other thoughts about that?
Hi, Mark. This is Tom, and I think you can just split the discussion between the drafting term and the fixed term, and which portion that Hans is suggesting. I think I agree with you, Mark, that Microsoft Word is very good when you cooperating for drafting and updating, because there's just division tracking. But after you finished the final version of the specification, everybody can use the text in many different ways. So you can just provide PDF, Word, or Markdown. Any version is available. And I think that the current problem is that there's no official Markdown version is existing. That's the point I think Hans is suggesting, and not suggesting that you should draft the whole, you should include the Markdown format into the drafting process. It's my private opinion, but
I think that's a good point. I agree with you. So I think what we should do is we should potentially have multiple versions. I'm curious to know, and when it comes to an ISO spec, Shane, do you think that is there guidelines, like, they have certain formatting rules, but what happens if we have the PDF version that's properly formatted, but we have several other versions of it? And I think we could do that, right? We can convert it into a Markdown, but it won't be adhering to the ISO formatting.
I mean, we're looking at the same situation as Microsoft Office OpenXML. So they have one version of it formatted for ECMA, the European Standard Organization, and revision 4 of that is identical to the ISO standard of Office OpenXML. So the short answer is, that there'll be the official kind of ISO PDF format, but we can have other remixes and releases as long as they map functionally identical. So a markup or something like that is no problem.
Yeah, I think we might, I don't know if it's necessary, but we might want to consider saying the PDF is the official version. We provide additional versions for convenience, but if there's any confusion, I don't know if formatting has any clarification in it, but if there's any confusion, the PDF is the one that governs.
I think that would work perfectly, and it's not unusual. So just running with that hypothetical before, some organizations focus on adopting ECMA standards, and if they adopt Office OpenXML revision 4, they know that they've got the ECMA standard, but they also know they can say, oh, we're using the ISO standard as well. So yeah, I think that notice would be perfect.
Okay, great. All right, that I think, by the way, you've taken this discussion further than the last meeting took it. Meaning we've got to this point. We can now move on to the last one and start the discussion, and I'll go back and get their feedback as well. So Hans is pointing out, you could read what he has here. This is right from his wiki thing. So I know some people have expressed this point on another occasion. So if people don't understand, basically, the spec intentionally does use the word reasonable efforts. And a number of legal people have really emphasized that importance, because we don't want to be open source is kind of flexible, right? And not all open source is properly licensed or in a disciplined way than some others, right? The discipline varies considerably. And companies avoid or are concerned about making a statement about being strictly, very definitively absolute. And they like to know that they put their best efforts. I mean, there could be different ways of describing that. Reasonable efforts versus I don't know, like commercially accepted efforts or something like that. But let me pause for a second. I don't want to add too much to other than what Hans has highlighted here. Do people find it a concern?
I think Hans might be putting quite a strict Germanic law interpretation here, because the term law applies strict liability may be true in certain civil law jurisdictions where you can only read off the legal statute. There's no further interpretation of the law. But in common law areas like the US, the use of the term reasonable effort with respect to legal activity is very common, and conflict over what is a legal effort is resolved by a judge. I just put a link into the chat just to show that best effort or reasonable effort or commercially reasonable terms are very common terms in civil law. This is a Canadian link. So
Yeah,
I think we might be having a kind of a culture interaction here, where Hans is talking about his experience in the German area, where strict liability, but in other areas, terminology like reasonable effort maps exactly to the legal expectation.
Okay, thank you for that understanding. That perspective from two different angles. Yeah, that is something to take into consideration. Meaning, is this universal enough the way we have it, or if we go the other route and become more restricted, is that more inhibiting for the larger global community? Okay. Any other thoughts about that? Do you feel that this is something we should be thinking about changing, or do you think what we have is okay?
I think it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the present is okay.
Okay, great. We're near the end. I just wanted to summarize that, that we do have, these are links that are also available, to get additional resources. Like I mentioned, there's the wiki, we have the FAQ, we have the ISO candidate draft, which is our official spec right now, it's 2.1. And finally, we have our issues list. So I will add comments into the issues list, into the mailing list, and continue to allow people to have other people who are not participating in these verbal dialogues to chime in, to speak up. But I think that it's been really helpful. I really like the fresh perspectives we got today.
Thank you so much, Mark. It was really great to go through this today. And of course, our friends and colleagues in Asia will have a chance to listen to the recording, and I'll prepare the recording for your next meeting as well. It should be ready in a couple of days.
Okay. Oh, as far as you mean for the next meeting? The next meeting is the second week in July, and I will be out of office.
We can.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I'll make I'll make that clear too. But yeah, there won't be a meeting in the beginning of next month. But right now, I think I'm going to be available for the fourth week of next month of July. I have to say my summer has been scheduling has been a little bit dynamic because everything's been shifted, right? Because COVID-19, and I have a son going off to college, and we've been trying to scramble to make the most of our summer. But anyway, having said that, thank you very much. As always, excellent feedback from a great community.
Thank you, Mark. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Bye, guys.